When you leave the Black church, it can feel really foreign when you go into other spiritual spaces. When you're a Black woman on an alternative spiritual path, it can be hard to connect and find your way. And you get into these rooms, you get into these new spiritual communities, and it doesn't feel like what you're used to. And you're asking yourself, is the culture in the room with us? Is spirit in the room with us? Because it doesn't feel like it is. And so that's what we're talking about today. I left the church, but I still want my spirituality to feel Black. So that's what we're diving into today. Hi, my name is Trina, and I am a spiritual coach and mentor for Black and Brown women on alternative spiritual paths. And I am also the creator of the Wild Waters Private Retreat, where I work with women who want to connect to their spiritual path in a deeper way. So if that sounds like you and this conversation is something you're into, I'm glad you're here. You're in the right place. And yeah, let's talk about it. I left the Black church, but I still want my spirituality to feel Black. And so I want to talk about the challenge of going into new spiritual communities, whether it's Buddhist communities, meditation communities, New Age communities, witchy communities, whatever it is, and not seeing Black American culture there or represented there. And I think it's important to name specifically Black American, because I think a lot of like Caribbean folks, African people from various countries have an experience with other spirituality. And not to say that Black Americans can't, we have a connection to hoodoo and things like that. But I think for us, for the most part, it's still connected to or intertwined with the church or a mosque or something like that. And so I'm going to talk about my experience. So this journey this path that I've been on has been over 20, almost 25 years. And so I have to be honest, I have found it really difficult to connect in spiritual communities outside of ones that I created myself or in very small ways. And I've learned that there are things that I can take from those communities, but my soul doesn't feel the same. It doesn't feel the same way that it felt in the church. And so I think for me, I want to just say, when I was in the church and I grew up in the church, I grew up in the Baptist church. I'm originally from the Midwest. And so I grew up in a very traditional, charismatic Baptist church that I loved. I loved my community. I loved singing in the choir, and I was very involved in the church. I was a church kid. I mean, when people joke about being at church, 2, 3, 4 days a week, on Sundays, you've got Sunday school, you've got regular service, you've got afternoon service, you eat in the fellowship hall, all that stuff. That was me. That's how I was raised. And my entire family was in the church and is still very much in the church. And then as I grew up, I really took my faith seriously. I studied the Bible. I taught classes. I was very it was very much a big part of my life. It wasn't something that I just did or performed. It was something that I truly, truly believed at the time, or at least I thought I did. And there were cracks in the foundation for sure in terms of my beliefs. And there were things about the church that were not perfect. I saw some things that really made me angry and that horrified me. Not so much in my church, but I think in the Baptist church community in general. But I didn't have any church hurt. That's not why I left. And if I could be there, I still would be there. It's just that my beliefs had changed and so much. And I really saw my faith and spirituality as a much broader, larger thing than the church. And I had to leave. But I was a musician. I was in the choir, and I loved it. I loved the music. I loved the soul. I loved devotion. It's something that just spoke to my spirit. It's a language that my soul understood. And so, and then now, I would say when I went to school, I went to Catholic school. So I spent time going to mass. So, I went to mass. I think in middle school, we went to mass once a week. And then in high school, elementary school, they didn't make us go. If you weren't Catholic, you didn't have to go to mass. But Middle school, I went every week, and then in high school, I went, like, maybe once a month or when there was something special going on, you had to go to mass, but it wasn't that often. But I was exposed to lots of other religions and things like that. And there were moments of beauty. There, one of the prayers that I find so beautiful is the Hail Mary. I think it is one of the most beautiful prayers. And so I think there's a reverence that I had for the Catholic Church in that experience that felt I don't know, I sort of held it with, it felt sacred in some ways, but the Black church, the Baptist church was my soul, it was my spirit. And so one of the things that I did not account for was leaving the church and how that would impact the spiritual experience and connection that I would feel or have. And so when I first embarked on, this alternative spiritual path, I wasn't sure what I believed. I was, thinking, I felt like I'm agnostic, but I was having these dreams about goddesses and all these other things. And so I spent a lot of time really on my own and reading books. And I started getting into a lot of self-help books. I actually had a health coach at the time who had given me a lot of sort of spiritual self-helpy books to read. And think of like Wayne Dyer. I used to devour Wayne Dyer's books. I really liked a lot of his perspective. And so I used to read a lot of his books and spend a lot of time in sort of that world. And it was the first time that I really was completely outside of a traditional Black spiritual experience. And it was something that I was like, okay, I can do it for a while because like I said, I went to mass and things like that, but it wasn't the majority of my experience. The majority of my experience was in the Black church, with the stomping and the clapping and the shouting and all of that. That's what I was used to. That's where I felt at home. And side note, I don't know that this conversation will resonate as much with people who either didn't grow up in the Baptist church or had a charismatic experience or who didn't like that. So if people were shouting in church, you didn't like it or it turned you off or whatever, this conversation, you might want to skip to the next video or watch one of my previous videos. But because I think what I'm talking about is if you really resonated with that Black traditional church experience, then I think you get where I'm coming from with this. But anyway, so I started spending time in some of these communities and reading these books, and it was also set up differently. So in the church, the way that it's set up is you give of your time, you give of your service. Now, people were paid in the church, at least in my church, like the musicians were paid and people got honorariums for doing different things, but it really was very communal. And so if there was, something, if we were cooking food after a service, we would, people chipped in to cook or they brought stuff. Or if we had toy drives or clothing giveaways or things like that, people volunteered their time. It was like we were all a part of this church community, and the community, the neighborhood where my church was located, we got involved and we're very involved in the neighborhood as well. And so it wasn't just a church, but it was a community. And so, but that spiritual experience was foundational. And so and it wasn't something that you paid for. I mean, you paid tithes and offering to keep the lights on, to pay the pastor, the musicians, whomever. But I didn't have one of those pastors that was getting rich off of people. He was a very smart man. He was educated. He was well educated. He had a great career before he became a full-time pastor. So that wasn't his thing. Um, but so it wasn't like a lot of, I think, spiritual communities outside of the church where it feels like you have to pay to get the experience. And because, you have to pay the leaders, like you have to pay for people's time. And look, as someone that does spiritual work, we don't have communities set up in a way where you've got the community griot or witch or whomever that's taken care of by the community so that they can eat and live and keep a roof over their head while they do their spiritual work. Like most communities don't function that way anymore, at least not in the United States. And so in a lot of these personal development, spiritual communities, it's an interesting mix of, again, personal development, spirituality, like business, money. It was all like jumbled together in a way that I wasn't used to. And so, but I'm like, I participated because in some of them, because I'm like, this is a lot closer to what I believe, even if the community doesn't feel the same. And I experienced this a lot too, excuse me, when I got into meditation. Excuse me, I'll just take some water here. Mm. When I started meditating, I went to this meditation center out. A mentor of mine at the time had recommended a place for me to go where she had learned to meditate and she was really involved in that community. And so I went and I learned their technique and I went on a silence retreat, which I loved. It was a 5-day silence retreat. And so it was so funny when I went, I was like, oh, 5 days of silence. I'm like, I'm sure I can do that. So I brought some music, I brought my books and my journal. And I know we're going to be meditating most of the time, but I'm like, it shouldn't be too hard to not speak for 5 days. But when I got there, what I didn't know was you weren't allowed to read or listen to music. It was like true silence. And so it was hard. It was hard like the first day or so, but after that, it really was opening and opened me up. And but anyway, being in this community of these folks who are, friendly enough, nice enough, but it didn't really feel like what I was used to. And I remember there was one night where it was like, I think they call it sangha, where you sing songs. So we were singing, but we weren't speaking, having conversations with each other. And they were singing one song, maybe This Little Light of Mine or something. It was something along those lines. I can't remember. And they had changed. I was like, oh, okay, this feels a little more familiar, but they had changed the lyrics. And I was like, oh, I didn't realize they were going to do that. So it was just, I don't know, it made me laugh at the time. But anyway, so it just didn't feel like, again, it didn't feel like what I was used to. But I stayed with it because, I felt like they were teaching me a very valuable skill and it was important. And in that specific community, there were it was a large Indian population that was in that community. And it was interesting to just see the way that people navigated their spirituality. Like it felt like it was, I don't know, it was more contained. I feel like in the Black church we're more emotional, we're more expressive. And because of that, I felt, I mean, that's how I was raised. I felt much more comfortable with that. And a lot of other traditions, no matter what they believe, they don't have that element to it. And some of it in the Black church, it really is cultural, like because there are a lot of Christian churches who aren't like that. So, but specifically in the Black church, it very much is a cultural moment, touch point experience. And so, I was just trying to figure out, like, do I really belong here? I think that was a question that kept coming up for me over and over again is, do I belong here? Is this my place? The thing that I didn't like about that community ultimately, although I did take the meditation techniques with me, and this was probably 15 years ago now. And I still use some of those meditation techniques to this day. But they had a guru for that community, and I was not into that. And I just remember thinking to myself, if I'm not praising Jesus like I did in the church, I'm not praising this human man that I have no idea who he is. So no. And they had him up on the altar and all that stuff. And I was just like, I'm not into that. And no disrespect to anybody who is, it just wasn't my thing. So I'm like, that off the top was a turnoff for me. But again, because I didn't grow up in the kind of church that, yes, we supported the pastor and he was definitely pedestalized, but he wasn't worshipped. And I think that is a lot of what I saw in on these on my on this alternative spiritual path in these non-Christian communities was there was a guru or a man who was like the leader that people revered and worshiped like God. And that was a turnoff to me. So again, not begrudging anybody if that's what they believe. It just wasn't for me. And so, I sort of trickled out of that community because it was like the longer you spent in the community, it seems kind of culty now that I think about it, but it was like the more time you spent in the community going to their meditation sessions and things like that, they brought their guru up more and more. And I was just like, I was out after that. And, there are other meditation, communities in the city that is not tied to a group or anything like that. It's just group meditation. And so I did some of that. And again, I think for me, having a spiritual experience where there's no singing, there's no drums, there's no foot stomping, there's no clapping, there's none of that. Like it's nice, but it didn't drill deep into me. And so this is something that I grappled with for a long time. I grappled with, how do I, you know, embrace this new spiritual path that I'm on in these communities. Um, and and also honor the spiritual experience that I need. And so for me that meant, I still listen to gospel music, I still listen to sermons, and I learned to extract things from sermons that wasn't necessarily about the Bible. Because to me, I believe that the Bible is allegory, and there's tons of lessons in there that are important, and lessons that are embedded, in my heart and in my soul, because that's how I was raised, and so it's still a big part of who I am. So I had to learn how to weave it all in together. I had to learn how to take things from the church that I still needed to lean into, and also balance it with this new path that I was on and trying to find my way in it. And the other thing is, I think when you are into New Age or different things like that, or again, if it's Buddhism, that was sort of more the thing that I leaned more into. I don't think you don't see as many Black people in the community, and if you do, they a lot of them didn't grow up in the church. And so they don't necessarily resonate with the need for, that traditional, Black Baptist church experience. And so I had to learn over time that it was okay if a spiritual community didn't have that. And it was hard. It took me a long time to adjust to that, and also realize that a lot of the spiritual communities that I encountered were not for me, because many of them also felt very transactional. And I find this a lot in the goddess sort of women's spirituality space that felt a little more transactional. Not all of it. There definitely were some amazing places where I felt embraced and had some amazing experiences there. I think I started just compartmentalizing it. And one of the things that really helped me along this path and in this way was getting into sitting in circle with a spiritual mentor. And she brought me in. She was someone that I had met at an event, and she essentially held a circle at her house with a bunch of friends and people that she knew. And she's a Latina woman, and she invited me into this community, and it was diverse. I live in New York City, so and a lot of times in a lot of spiritual communities, even in New York City, they're not necessarily that diverse. Excuse me, but her circles were very diverse, and we had food after. People would bring food to share after, and the way that she wove in culture, and all different sorts of culture, particularly but again, her culture and others, it really made me feel a lot more comfortable. And so that became a foundational community for me for some years, and that was a big part. The other thing is I really leaned into personal development, and I think personal development is tricky because it can be almost used as a substitute for spirituality. And again, I think it weaves together, but it's not the same thing. And so I think I convinced myself at some point that I didn't need that spirituality in the same way. But like I said, I was still listening to gospel music. I was listening to sermons, things like that, even though I had no intentions of going back to church. And so I was like, I could still catch it and do all of that. And so yeah, but it was hard. It was really hard to navigate and find my way. And then I started running my own circles with a friend of mine about 10 years ago. And I learned to bring in my culture and my soul and my music and all of my things that are important to me in a spiritual experience. And so I used to say that I hold circles like a Baptist preacher because saying that in jest sort of, but I really believe in bringing in the ancestors and bringing in that energy, that same pulse that I felt in the church into my spiritual life. And I think as I really spent more time in my own spiritual practice and developing that, I weave in all of that into, my own private spiritual experience and practice. And so, and then sharing that with others is something that became, important to me to do. And I think when you step out of the church, it can be, as a Black woman, it can be hard to find your way and find your path, and it can be isolating. And I think it's important culturally to feel like you belong. um it Yeah, it can be really hard. And I think the anchor that I have found outside of the church has been ancestral connection. So, revering ancestors and bringing them into all of the spiritual communities, that has worked for me. And also letting things be what they are, and they all don't have to be in one place. I think the thing with the church is that you got it all in the same place. You got community, you got your spiritual experience, your shouting, you got your teaching, you got everything in one place. And I think when you step out of the church, you step off that path, that you have to source from different places. So you might go to one place um, for meditation. You might go to another place for maybe a teaching of some sort of spiritual teaching or something like that. You might go to another place to participate in community and spiritual community. That might be another thing. And then the music, that might be another thing. And so you might find yourself in three or four different communities. They all just might not, you might not be able to get it all in one place. And again, that can be, I think it takes some getting used to. And like I said, I've been on this path a long time now, and I definitely don't have it perfected. And I still look for opportunities to connect with my culture. There's an event called Choir Rehearsal with Friends, and I really love it because basically what they do is it's a few hours of people who sang in the choir who grew up as church kids, where you sing, gospel music and music you sang at church, and then you sing R&B music, and it kind of blends it all together. And I went last summer, and I had a ball. I had a great time. And so nowadays I find ways to connect into that traditional Black church experience, Christian spiritual experience that I need, the Holy Ghost, the Holy Spirit. I find ways to connect in for me, while knowing that my beliefs have shifted and changed, and I can still have that. I can have it all. I can have it, and put it all together. And so the trick is weaving it together. It's weaving the experience, weaving the tools, weaving the things that you need for yourself. Because ultimately, spirituality, I mean, it's for you. It's, to me, spirituality, it's the thing that comforts us and bolsters us, in this life, and to help us get more meaning, fulfillment out of it, and to feel connected to something bigger than ourselves, to know it's not just us here, and there's nothing that we're connected to. That's what I believe it's really for and about. And so how you weave it together is your business. And one of the things that I've had to go on the journey of is finding more music that's not necessarily Christian music, but music that speaks to my soul and spirit. And so I have found that music in other languages, a lot of South African music, even though most of that is still Christian in nature, but not knowing the lyrics, I just find it speaks to my soul. It's very beautiful. And there's groups like Beautiful Chorus that and India Irie, people like that that I think understand that touch point in the culture in the church, but also create this music for people on alternative spiritual paths. And so I'm always on the hunt for music like that. And again, I still listen to gospel music. Not as much. I listen to it less and less, but I still do listen to it when I'm having a really difficult time, a hard day, or want to connect to my ancestors, connect with my mom. I still sing. I sing a lot of those songs. I sing hymns. I do all of that because it's not just about the lyrics, and some of the lyrics are I think are universal principles. So there's that part of it, but also like I said, it's very much cultural in so many ways, and so that is a big part of what I connect to. So if you find yourself, this is something that you're struggling with, I'm certainly happy to chat with you. I have a, a free 30-minute chat where I'll talk to you about if this basically finding your way in your spiritual path. Like I said, I offer private virtual retreats for folks. And so that free call is just to just see what you got going on and how I can support you and if that retreat's a good fit for you. So the link is below this video if you're interested in that. But anyway, I think the thing is that you have to weave it together for yourself. If you are missing that cultural element that you grew up with in the church in your current spiritual life, that you have to think about it differently and begin to craft it for yourself um, in a way that feels good and comfortable to you. And I think this is one of the things that will prevent a lot of people from leaving the church is and look, and I understand. I do understand, although the church has changed a lot in the past 25 years, and I think a lot of people have left, but I think you have to give yourself permission to create your spirituality the way that you want it to be. And when you grow up in a religion, and you grow up in traditional church, it can be hard to think that, oh, I can be the architect of my spiritual life and I can craft it the way that I want. I can take the pieces that I need and spit out the bones and throw out the rest that doesn't fit. That can feel, what's the word I'm looking for? Uh, Anti-spiritual. That's not what I'm looking for, but it can feel like heresy. It can feel like you're doing something wrong, and you're not. But again, I know that's a mental thing that you really have to get over in terms of that of a hurdle in your own mind and heart and soul about what is proper spirituality. And so, but take the journey, you're not in a rush. Find the things that fit for you. Find, the places where you need to hold on to the church. And hey, and still go to church. Maybe if that's what you need to do, I go to church. I don't really go, but every so often I might go for a special occasion or something like that. But if that's something that you're feeling like you need, you don't have to buy into everything to still go to church. I don't think. I think if you have completely stepped away from it, it can be hard to show up every week like you're probably used to doing before. So you don't need to do that. But every so often, if you need to go there, go. And there's nothing wrong with that. Mhm. So, yeah, what have I learned from this experience? Again, my soul is black. My soul, my spirit is black. I love having black spiritual experiences. That is where I feel most comfortable. That is where I feel most at home. But over the years, I have learned to expand and broaden that definition. And as a result of that, where I feel the spirit has expanded. And so I feel it in different ways and different kinds of music and different kinds of experiences. But there's nothing like that black church experience. And I don't know that I'll ever have that again. Who knows? But I do create it in my own way, and you can create it in your own way as well. And I'm happy to help you figure that out and how to do that. So again, link below this video if you'd like to chat, see how I can help you with that and support you with that. But just know that you can build this however you want because your spiritual path is yours. It's your path and it's meant to work for you how it's meant to work. And so when you leave church, when you leave the church and you deconstruct and you start on this path of the unknown, there's not a lot of guideposts. There's not a lot of guides, which is why I'm talking about this and I'm having these conversations because I remember how lost and lonely I felt. And in the church, though, you are convinced that if that's your experience, that you're doing something wrong, and you're not. You're just doing something new, something that you're out of your depth with, and you learn it little by little. As you go, you figure out the things that you need, and you take what you need, and you put it in your satchel, and you keep going. And so I encourage you to figure it out, to give yourself time to explore and to think about the church and what it is that you needed from it and that you still need and want from it and how can you recreate that in some way. So maybe it means going back to the church for some things, or maybe there's ways in which you can create it in other community for yourself. So that's what I would encourage you to do and to keep in mind. So I think that's it for this video. Let me know if you left the church, but you still feel like you want a Black experience, but maybe you've been out here, you've been on your path, and you missed that, but you're trying to create it, or maybe you found a way to do it. I'd love to hear about it. So leave me a comment, share your thoughts. I'd love to hear from you. And that's it. Thank you so much for being here, and I will talk to you soon.